So it's the day after the 2021 Armenian parliamentary elections, and the results are as follows. Acting Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his civil contract party at 53.92%, the Armenian Alliance of former President Robert Kocharyan at 21.04%, and the I Have Honor coalition of Serge Sargsyan and Artur Vanetsyan at 5.23%. I'm joined now by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian to unpack these results. Eric, welcome back.
Thank you.
So can you explain in layman's terms to people what this 53, 21 and 5% mean, what this really means?
Well, I mean, what you need to do is you need to compare it to the polling beforehand. So we were expecting results that were a lot more closer. I think many people will look at these numbers and are going to think that the former president underperformed. The former president did not underperform. He actually did quite well. His problem was that he had, in the IRI polling and other polling, he had 2.5 to 1 negatives, which means on day one he doesn't have access to 60% of the voters. So within the context of who he had access to, he won a clear majority of them. He won 21, 22%. So he actually did where he ended up where he was supposed to end up. The issue was that the prime minister himself did better than anybody expected. We were expecting him to come in somewhere in the high 30s, low 40s, most likely high 30s. And what this means is one of two things. That it means in the polling there were a lot of people who were inclined to be with him and were not willing to say it. And you have the shy voter thing in polling. Or that these people were genuinely undecided and they broke his way at the end, or significant numbers of them broke his way, because there were people going, yesterday morning there were people who were undecided. There were people walking into the polling stations undecided. And I think they clearly ended up voting mostly against the return of the old regime. If you're going to read the short understanding of what happened yesterday, that's what it really is.
But just to be clear to our watchers, this means that he can form a comfortable majority government?
Yes. Yeah, the way that the seats are distributed, he's going to have a smaller majority than he did the last time, but he'll have a clear one-party majority.
Okay. And former President Robert Kocharyan has already challenged the results. What was your reaction to that development?
You're down by 30 points. I mean, what is there to challenge? There's, I think a little over 100. The challenges or the questionable, votes cast are in the hundreds. And there was more than 1.2 million votes cast. So I don't think that's particularly credible. I don't think it's going to change anything. I think they obviously expected to do a lot better. I think they were setting up the day after activities long before, and they thought they'll do a lot better. So they had this fake Gallup polling that shows it a lot closer. Yesterday there was a whole bunch of tracking exit polls supposedly that showed them a lot better. And they were trying to be 4 or 5 points behind, then you can make a legitimate case and bring people out in the street saying the election was stolen. But when you're down by 30 points, you really don't have much of a case to make.
And what do you think, what were the reasons for the vote that swung to Nikol Pashinyan being partially underestimated? Do you think that there were any factors that led to this?
There's always elite bias in all these political conversations because the prime minister's base is primarily working class, it's rural, it's poorer. So they're not part of the parlor conversations in the city and elite circles. You can just see it. I mean, you can see it in people's cars. If it's a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW, they had 24 on it. It's a Kocharyan number. Old cars, used cars, construction workers, it was always number 3. So there's a distinct class bias that people missed it because people had ended up talking to each other. And I think in some ways this is the last act of the revolution. I think you can make the case that the revolution ended yesterday because in April 2018, the majority of the people in this country told the old regime to leave, and yesterday they told them to stay away. This was not a mandate for the prime minister. This is a mandate against the old regime.
And now both forces will enter parliament and will be able to go head to head in a parliamentary fashion. Obviously, it's no secret to Armenians that there's a lot of animosity between Pashinyan and Kocharyan. So what do you think? Maybe is it a better way to handle this, to have a parliamentary format and to go head to head in that arena?
I think it's very good for Mr. Kocharyan and the people supporting him to be in parliament. I think it's actually very good for Serge Sarkisian and his supporters to be in parliament. Because the truth is they represented a significant percentage of the country. It's a significant minority of the country. But these are people that have been blocked out for the last 2 years. So it's much better for them to be in parliament making their case rather than standing outside, demanding resignations. So I think the fact that their voice will be in the parliament is a good thing. What is not a good thing is that there's not fresh voices in the parliament that is neither of these two groups. And in some ways, this is, if I'm Pashinyan, this is the result I wanted. I'm not getting fresh faces as my opponents. My opponents are people, in the case of Mr. Kocharyan, who has 2.5 to 1 negatives. In the case of Mr. Serge Sarkisian, he has 6 to 1 negatives. You couldn't be blessed with better opponents than these. Who would make him nervous is a 40-year-old business person, who has no political history and baggage, and can actually gather a popular support around him. So in one way, it's good that they're there, but the absence of other forces is not a good thing.
And what would your message be to the Civil Contract Party and its leadership, to the victors?
If you ever study the Greek classics, the basic lesson is, who would the gods destroy, they first make proud. Don't read too much into this victory. This is a rejection of the old regime. You've been given a second chance. You need to focus on the fundamental reforms you didn't do in the last 2 years, judiciary. And since then, what's been added is the critical need for military reform, security reform, putting together a competent foreign policy. This is no time to be focused on personal politics or vendettas. More importantly, it doesn't matter who voted for you, who didn't vote for you. You're the prime minister of the whole country. And he needs to be a statesman if he's capable of that. So I think obviously people there were, I wouldn't call it deep state, there were people in the state that were blocking reforms, hoping for a return of Kocharyan. That was very obvious. I mean, you see in the mass what's going on. For example, in the foreign ministry, some of these were obviously politically motivated. And those people have eggs on their faces at this point. So some of those people will obviously go. It's the nature of politics. But he's been given a lifeline. He has not been given a mandate. He's given a second chance. And let's not forget, 2 years ago, he got more than 70% of the vote. He goes on like this, 2 more years, he's at 30%, he loses the election next time. So he's been given a second chance, but the focus needs to be on governing, not on politics, and not on marching in the streets. Do the things that you failed in the first 2 years. That's his mandate. It's not his mandate to go after people or settle political scores.
And also, I'm curious, you said previously when we did an interview that around election times, things sort of tend to freeze, and then once the election happens, you can expect the opposite. Do you think now that all those processes we've been talking about for months, the POWs issue, border demarcation, that those will start to roll?
I think, to the extent that some of these things have outside actors, it really depends on much bigger issues than Armenia itself. But however, at this point, they need to they need to move, and some of these things will unfreeze as far as policy issues. But it really depends on the competence of the government. I mean, how good are you in bringing in administrative people that can actually push an agenda forward and make some of these changes happen? Some of the international issues are obviously complicated and involve other actors. But I can see whatever games that other people were playing to get particular outcomes, and which they probably didn't get. You can go back to more normality and hopefully solve some of these issues.
And there was talk that this was, some people were saying at least, that this was a contest between democracy and security, which are both valid concerns. And those who believe that Pashinyan epitomized not insecurity. So I'm curious, what would your message be to those people who, in a sense, did have a valid concern about security in the country?
Yeah, it's a valid concern, but it's a false choice. It needs to be a false choice because it's a dangerous choice. And I think it was something that the Kocharian forces relied on. But if they relied on that, if that was their campaign, a lot of people said that they feared Kocharian more than they feared insecurity at our borders, which is not a high compliment for them. Yes, but we should not be satisfied. Those are false choices. And I think this is national security. I think people need to understand, and he needs to understand it, Prime Minister. This is where you unite the country. Reforming the military, building a military industrial complex, securing our borders. These are something that everyone can agree on. And unity is not unanimity, but he needs to be the bigger person. We need to bring people together to focus on these issues. And given the fact that Pashinyan's perceived weakness is national security, defense, that's the first thing you have to attack. It's the first thing that you need to change people's minds about.
And I just want to ask, you know a lot about opinion polls which predict what election outcomes will be. I'm curious what you think went wrong in Armenia with regards to opinion polls, because even those opinion polls which weren't connected to Gallup International were not projecting a result like this.
Polling actually internationally is in crisis as far as the results that they get. And I think there's a distinct class bias with these things. And I think we had some of that here. And again, this is a country that's coming out of a totalitarian systems, and I'm not sure how freely people will give you their opinion over the phone once they know they know where you live and who you are. Especially if you live in some rural outskirt that is in the middle of the city. And the Prime Minister's base, if you look at it geographically, the further he got away from Yerevan, the better he did. The more rural, the better he did. And those are the hardest people to reach for pollsters. There's built-in biases in polling. So I think all of them worked against him. But I think there was also social pressure because there was so much negativity about him. People don't necessarily want to say they vote for him in polling. So I think there's an element of that also. But these are results that surprised me, which means I suspect these were not late deciders. I think there was some of that. These are people that were always inclined towards him. They just weren't willing to publicly say it.
Well, Eric, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.